Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Baran, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Baran.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Baran. Our producer is Jody Mayer-Piazza. There's a lot going on in Washington these days. The Trump administration is only 8 weeks old, but it seems to be changing policies and institutions everywhere all at once in D.C. and around the world. With all the changes, I've been asking myself, how do private individuals and organizations deal with this new government? And tradition says that, well, you ought to go out and hire a lobbyist. That's how you deal with government. But one of the promises made by Donald Trump is that he was going to clean out the Washington swamp. I don't know what he meant by that, but I assume he meant that he was going to try and change the lobbying culture and perhaps try and get rid of lobbyists, but I'm not sure he can do that. My guest today is a longtime observer of lobbying in Washington. For over 20 years, Brody Mullins was an investigative reporter. In 2023, he and a team at the Wall Street Journal won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting about government officials and their conflicts of interest. The following year, Simon & Schuster published his book, which he co-authored with his journalist brother, Luke Mullins, entitled The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. For those of you who are out of town and listening to this episode, K Street is Washington parlance for the historic office location of many lobbying firms, law firms, and trade associations. Brody Mullins is a Washington native. He grew up in D.C., went to school there, and currently resides in D.C. with his family. He did go away for college at Northwestern University, but that seems to be his only detachment from D.C. Our topic today is the so-called Washington swamp. What has it been like? What's it like today? And what's it going to look like in the future? Brody, welcome to Early Returns. I'm delighted you're able to join us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I feel a little funny. I feel like so much of what I've learned about lobbying has come from you. So I feel like I should be interviewing you on for this podcast.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I have to admit to our listeners that both of us are quite familiar with the subject of lobbying, and in some way our respective livelihoods have depended on it. You've been reporting on lobbying, and I have been providing legal advice on how to comply with all the laws and rules that regulate lobbying. So for those of us who are in the D.C. swamp and not lobbying, we still are very dependent on it for our livelihoods. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you just personally before we get into the topic of lobbying is, how is it you decided to be a journalist? I mean, are you one of these young guys who just got wowed by the Washington Post and Bernstein and Woodward? Or, usually journalists make a decision in ways that are unexpected. Is that the case for you?
Yeah, I think you almost hit the nail on the head. I was born in 1974, so Bernstein and Woodward were a little before my time. Not by much, but yeah, I grew up in Washington, D.C. My dad worked for the federal government, for the Federal Communications Commission. When you grow up in D.C., D.C. is a small town or was a small town. So your neighbor is the chief of staff to Al Gore, and your other neighbor used to work for Ronald Reagan. And you sort of, politics is sort of part of the conversation. I remember we watched the nightly news every night. We got the Washington Post in the morning. And I think I started off by reading the sports section, but then I would sort of morph into reading the front page. And you're right. I was one of those strange people that at a very young age, I decided I wanted to be a reporter, not just a reporter, but a reporter in Washington, D.C., and not just a reporter in Washington, D.C., for the Wall Street Journal. My mom's business partner was John Harwood's sister. If you remember John Harwood, he was a famous longtime political reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And through my mom's connection, I got sort of an internship at the Wall Street Journal in 1992. Which really was not an internship. It was me coming in a few days a week to hand out the faxes, if people remember what faxes are, and to literally clip the newspapers, which I thought was so much fun because you got to read these stories by these giants and then literally hand the stories to the reporters to put in their files. Before there was an internet, there were file cases, and that was my job at the Wall Street Journal.
And You went off to Northwestern University, which has a very famous journalism school. I gather that you did that right after you were an intern at the Wall Street Journal, if I got the age correct.
That's correct. There's one caveat, which is when I was going off to college, I spoke to all these reporters at the Wall Street Journal, and they said, don't major in journalism. Do not be a journalism major. Go learn something that you can write about. So I thought that was good advice. So when I went to Northwestern, I was an economics major, took a lot of political science. So I sort of understand economics and the Fed policy a little bit. I was comfortable with numbers. And I think that was a big advantage. As you know, in Washington, there's hundreds or thousands of reporters, and a lot of them are not comfortable with numbers and data. And so I thought that sort of set me apart, because to find true stories in DC, there's so much smoke and puffery that to find true stories, a lot of times you have to go to the data. In our case, the campaign finance data or Fed data or labor statistics that really show facts. If you're just talking to people, you can get 16 versions of the truth and never really know what is the truth.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of the president who apparently said he was always looking for a two-handed economist, right? Because economists would look at the data and they say, well, on the one hand, it could be this way, and on the other hand, it could be this
right,
other
that's
way.
True. That's true.
So reading the data is just the beginning.
That's true.
It gives you
that's
all
true.
the numbers, but nobody knows what it all means.
That's true.
That's why journalists become important, to try and interpret it. Well, when you got out of college, then I take it your first job was with some publication. Which one was it?
Yeah. So, back to Washington, D.C. being a small town, a kid who I drove to high school, his father's family owned a small newspaper that covered the Federal Communications Commission. It's called Communications Daily. It was the Bible of the Federal Communications Commission. It covered every rule, regulation that the agency worked on, and state public utility commissions. And so I was hired to be the youngest reporter there. I think I was making $20,000 or $24,000 a year, and that seemed like a ton of money. But more importantly, as you know, in DC, it's all about specialization. So for a year, I was in the weeds of telecom policy and became sort of an expert in telecom. And, at the time, there's dozens of important industries in Washington that we follow, but this was right after the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which deregulated and upended the telecommunications world, changing AT&T, changing the cable companies. The internet hadn't yet started. So I sort of found myself at the beginning of sort of internet and tech policy. Back then it was called telecommunications, but that allowed me to sort of become an expert in a policy that got me hired by a place called Congress Daily in, I think, 1999 or 2000 or so, where I covered energy, environment, some healthcare, banking, and communications policy.
Well, what would you consider to be your first big story as a journalist, and where were you writing at that time?
So I moved from Congress Daily, where I spent about 5 years, mainly covering the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And I thought that was a great way to learn how DC works, because committees and subcommittees are really where the action happens, especially on business regulatory issues. And most reporters are covering presidential tweets or presidential press conferences or votes in the House and Senate floor. But the real business, for industry, happens in committees and subcommittees. And I was there for 5 years to really learn how that worked. And that helped me get a job later at the Wall Street Journal, because I knew sort of how Congress works and how businesses operate and how lobbyists try to get things done, or usually try to get things blocked in committees. But my first big story, I think, was, we all remember Jack Abramoff. In the Jack Abramoff scandal, which I guess was the early 2000s, most of those stories were written by the Washington Post. I wrote a story about one of Abramoff's co-conspirators, a guy named Mike Scanlon. Mike Scanlon was a top aide to Tom DeLay and went into business with Jack Abramoff and really helped him defraud his Indian tribes and some of his other clients. I found out that Mike Scanlon was engaged to another former Tom DeLay aide named Emily Miller. Those two had this sort of fabulous relationship, and they shared all their secrets. And then the engagement was called off by him. And that she turned out to be someone who was very important in bringing to an end, or bringing to light, the scandal. So she was sort of the whistleblower that drew the whole Abramoff scandal to an end.
And how would you characterize or summarize the Abramoff scandal? I mean, he was a lobbyist. He was quite well known. He was quite flamboyant. He was not only known for doing a lot of lobbying, particularly in Congress, but He even owned a restaurant where he would serve free meals, apparently, to a lot of politicians and government officials. So he sort of broke the edges of lobbying in novel ways, which ultimately got him in trouble as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, we write a little bit about Jack Abramoff in our book. There's been several other books written about him, so we sort of gloss over him. But Abramoff was a big-time Republican lobbyist at the time that Tom DeLay and House Republicans really held sway in Washington. He had dozens of clients, including several major Indian tribes. And it turned out that, he did two things to sort of put himself in the news and get himself thrown in jail. One was defrauding his Indian clients. He sort of set up fake lobbying accounts and fake public affairs accounts that they funded. And he and Michael Scanlon actually never did any work for them. They just sort of pocketed all this money. He might be better known, though, for really pushing the lines of the lobbying rules. At the time, there were a different set of lobbying ethics rules, but he had boxes at FedEx Field, and there weren't Washington Nationals back then, but to bring members of Congress and staff to Washington Capitals games, to Commanders games.
He had a box at the Baltimore Orioles stadium.
I think that's right. Yeah, he had things everywhere. But also he would bring members of Congress and staff golfing in Scotland. He'd bring reporters too on trips like that. And he owned this restaurant, as you mentioned, called Signatures. And it was the night spot for all young Capitol aides. I was there a couple of times myself, and the check never seemed to arrive. And his young lobbying aides would take these members of Congress and take staffers and basically pay for whatever they needed. The reason we write about this scandal in our book is, at least in one of your favorite words, HLOGA, the 2007, I believe, Honest Leadership in Government Act, which is the real major lobbying and ethics reform bill of my time, at least.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you about these laws that increased regulation of lobbying. The Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, which is enacted, I think, in 2007, imposed an awful lot of disclosure obligations on any entities or individuals who were lobbying. And it also had one feature that exists to this day, is that any lobbyist who files one of these forms has to certify under penalty of perjury that they have not violated any of the House or Senate gift rules in terms of giving freebies to congressmen or staff. You've obviously saw what lobbying was like before that law, and you've seen it now after that law. Has it changed things? Have these legal reforms actually had an effect that improved both the activity of lobbying as well as maybe greater public confidence in the legitimacy of lobbying?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the things we write about in our book is that every time Congress approves a well-intentioned ethics or lobbying reform, there's an unintended consequence. A really good one is McCain-Feingold that maybe we can talk about later, or even Citizens United, which should be a good one, which is obviously a Supreme Court decision, not a congressional action. But on this one, I think it's sort of a double-edged sword. I think what the goal was this is a Nancy Pelosi and Democratic passed legislation, ethics reform. The goal was to end the cozy relationships between lobbyists and members of Congress, to prevent someone from Tom DeLay being so close with the Jack Abramoff so that Jack Abramoff could get favors. In fact, Abramoff went to jail because he bribed members of Congress, with these golf trips and with campaign donations and with golf outings and sports tickets and on and on. So that was certainly not a good scene, and it has been cleaned up. At the same time, we have now a system in which lobbyists, corporate executives, even union officials or public interest officials are really not allowed to have, it's very difficult to have conversations or relationships with members of Congress or staff. I mean, a key to Washington, which I know best, but probably every other industry, is relationships and trust. And because members of Congress are not allowed to accept anything of value from a registered lobbyist, basically can't go to dinner, you can't go to lunch, you can't get a cup of coffee. And that sort of limits the creation of those relationships and limits the trust. The reason that trust matters is that members of Congress and the staff are particularly, very young, have usually not worked in the industry. They're not policy experts. They need to learn about policies and how industries work in order to create laws and regulations for those industries. And therefore, you need to talk to the companies, you need to talk to industries, and you need to trust the information you're getting. So we have a system now where we might have gone too far in the other direction, where there are very few relationships. And therefore, I think staffers are not getting good information about the unintended consequences of laws or regulations that they write. And I think that can hurt democracy in the long run.
Well, there's one element here that you're touching on, which I always like to remind people about, which is that lobbying is in the Constitution. It's in the Bill of Rights. It's in the First Amendment that in addition to freedom of speech and press and so forth, there's a provision there that says that citizens have the right to seek redress of their grievances, which is the phrase in the Constitution, from government officials. So I have the impression that government officials, frankly, oftentimes would prefer not to have to deal with lobbyists. But the founders of this country wisely said, you're going to have to deal with the people you're going to regulate and legislate against. So that's preserved in our Constitution.
Yeah.
And what has also happened in recent times in conjunction with these additional disclosure laws and the difficulty in gaining access to government officials is that the governing process has become much more secretive itself. And Congress does not legislate, for example, the way it did 40 years ago. I mean, they would have legislation proposed, they would have hearings, they would have markups, there would be a lot of public activity in the legislative process. These days, and I would say this is true whether the Republicans are in charge or the Democrats are in charge, for certainly the last 10 or 15 years, legislation gets created within the majority leadership in some fashion, somewhat secretively, which is why the lobbyists are increasingly important. They're trying to find out what are they doing? What are they going to propose? Because you know that the legislation is going to pop up. It's going to get put on the calendar for a vote with very short order, just a matter of days sometimes, and then get voted on. So the process has changed. Lobbying is more difficult, more demanding. We actually probably have more lobbyists than we used to because everybody's trying to figure out what are they going to do? And you mentioned early on that lobbyists in particular are trying to prevent bad things from happening more than trying to enact things and help their clients. So is that a fair characterization that I've just made, that the legislative and governing process has become more secretive and a little more out of reach of both lobbyists and the clients?
I agree with that, but let me go back to a couple of points. One, yes, lobbying is constitutionally protected under the First Amendment, just like reporters are, and that's fascinating and a great part of our country. Secondly, it goes beyond there. In the Federalist Papers, the founders of the country talked about how there would be lobbying, that they expected there to be a lobbying industry. They didn't call them lobbyists or special interests. They called them factions. They said there'd be a faction of pro-industry people and there'd be a faction of pro-worker people. And that basically ended up being sort of the Chamber of Commerce or corporate America against labor unions. And what they thought is that those two factions would be of equal size and strength, and they would sort of battle each other over important legislation to reach compromises. And for the most part, that system has worked for the last 200 years. What we've seen, though, and I found this fascinating doing our research, is we've gone through periods where one faction, let's say the industry faction, has more power or influence than the worker faction, and then periods of time when the worker faction has more power or influence than the industry faction. I mean, for example, after the industrial age, we had the big powerful monopolies in Standard Oil and JP Morgan and the railroad barons, when industry had so much power and workers had little power. But then we went into the progressive era right after there, where we created the antitrust laws and rules and regulations. And from the New Deal to the Great Society, it was the other way around, where industry had very little influence and consumer groups had lots of power. So anyway, we have this back and forth through history that's fascinating.
You're touching on important points in the evolution of lobbying and the role of government. I would say that back in the industrial age, as I recall, government was only responsible for about 4% of GDP in terms of spending. And of course, today, I'm now pandering to your expertise with numbers. I think now government spending accounts for about 23 or 25% of gross domestic product, GDP. And what does that mean? That reflects the growing importance, both economically and also in the lives of Americans, of government. They spend more, they collect more in taxes, they regulate more, and they've gotten really big. And it's true that the swinging historically between capital and labor and their relative role in the economy does change. But, we're witnessing one of those phenomenon right now with the Department of Education and the dispute as to why we have a Department of Education, and I'm a little older than you are, and I remember the 1976 Democratic Convention, where the largest representation of delegates was from the National Education Association, teachers. And it was there that then candidate Jimmy Carter promised that if he were elected, he would create a Department of Education and separate it from what was historically known as Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW. So that was 50 years ago. And now we see the effect of the power of labor, which was considerable in the 1970s, being eroded to the point where it really kind of been discredited, both in the political process and also, I would say, publicly, as an effective means and representation of the working man and woman. In fact, teachers, who everyone loves, are now the focus of, why is it that notwithstanding a separate Department of Education and all this enormous spending over the last 50 years, the results in the public education system are so negative. Performance by students has declined. I know there are a lot of reasons, but it's all part of the debate that's going on now. Well, your book, which has been very well received, is very interesting because it does cover both the history of lobbying as well as all of these important episodes in lobbying, which seem to be focused primarily on the excesses of lobbying, the illegal conduct that has manifested itself in improper lobbying by people like Jack Abramoff and others. What would you say is the lessons that a reader can gain from your book about lobbying, other than it's very well written and entertaining? Because obviously when you're writing about some of these colorful characters, you've got some great stories to share.
Yeah. So I think like all books, we don't write about, as authors, the normal lobbyists. We're looking for the excess. The book's called The Wolves of K Street. It's not saying that everyone is a wolf. It's like we're looking for the people who are over the top. And I think that, we found them, and we write about a cast of characters, I think 4 or 5 lobbyists who help show how the lobbying industry has changed, how companies have come to power, and then how, these lobbyists have gone over the top and they've all crashed and burned. 2 ended up dead. I think 2 went to jail, and they've all sort of come crashing down, except for actually Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort went to jail, came crashing down, and is now back. So,
Well, he's out of jail. I don't know how back he is, but he has a very colorful history that I'm sure is detailed in your book.
My point, though, is that there's a saying in journalism, for right or wrong, that we don't write about the planes that land. You write about the planes that crash. And
Yes.
If we're writing a book about Major League Baseball, we're not writing about the average baseball player. We're writing about Babe Ruth. So yes, we're writing about the people who are more excessive and the people who are crossing the lines, but that's what makes for an interesting book.
Well, how many lobbyists are there in Washington these days? Do you have a number?
Well, that's a great question. In 2007, back to Hiloga, you were talking about some of the unintended consequences, or I was talking about unintended consequences of ethics reforms. In 2007, when Democrats and Congress passed the post-Abramoff lobbying reform, there was something like 14,000 registered lobbyists in D.C. And one of the things, as you know, that Hiloga did, the ethics reform did, was sort of create sort of a bad name for lobbyists. If you were a registered lobbyist, you couldn't do these things. If you're not a registered lobbyist, you can do those things. If you're a registered lobbyist, you have to fill out this additional disclosure. If you're not a registered lobbyist, you don't have to. As you know, the threshold for becoming a lobbyist is essentially if you spend 20% or more of your time actively talking to members of Congress or preparing to talk to members of Congress. So what a lot of lobbyists did was say, hey, you know what? I'm below that threshold. I'm not spending 20% of my time. So instead, they say I'm an advisor or I'm a consultant, and therefore you don't have to comply with some of these rules given certain cases. So what that means is that in 2007, there were 14,000 lobbyists. Today, there's 13,000 lobbyists. And there's no way that there are fewer people trying to influence government. It's just that so many people have said, I'm not going to register, in part, I think, because of these Hiloga era regulations.
Well, you have to put some standards in the rules in some way. Otherwise, everyone would have to register as a lobbyist. And as we've already discussed, there are limits imposed practically as well as constitutionally on how burdensome you can make lobbying. So you can trigger lobbying, you can require disclosure, but somebody who, for example, comes into Washington as part of a group, and we've seen many groups of people coming in, they're from an industry or a profession. They get organized. They have a day on the Hill, it's called, where they go and visit their congressmen and congresswomen and the staff. If they come in for one day in a year, you can't make them lobbyists and impose all of these disclosure and regulatory burdens on them. But it seems to me that we've gotten to a point where there's more meaningful disclosure than there was before Haloga, in the sense that the rules as to when you do have to register, when you do have to report, are a little clearer. And it provides a boatload of data. So now we know who is lobbying and which parts of government they're lobbying and what are their issues and how much they're spending on it. So every 3 months, there's a quarterly reporting requirement. Lots of journalists, a lot of your colleagues, and I'm sure you in the past would say, wow, look how much money has been spent by the technology industry lobbying in the past quarter. So we are getting even more information, and I think it's reliable, as well as patting down, I think, the excesses that we saw, particularly during the Abramoff period. Well, now we've got a new sheriff in town, right? President Trump. Is he changing things at all? Is this administration changing any of this?
He's absolutely changing things. One of the things that Donald Trump has sort of shown us is sort of how over time presidents have wielded power, or how political power is held in Washington. So I was not here before 1974, as we discussed, but before 1974, Washington was a different town, and political power was held by a small group of people: the president, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, maybe some committee chairs. Those guys basically made all rules and policy and laws in the country. And therefore, back then, companies who had lobbyists really only needed to know one or two lobbyists who were connected to that small group of people. In our book, we start writing about Tommy Boggs as sort of the original of those relationship lobbyists. Tommy Boggs grew up in D.C. His dad was a member of Congress, was the House Majority Leader. His mom later was elected to Congress, and she was on the Ways and Means Committee for more than a decade. So he grew up in an era where he knew JFK and LBJ and Sam Rayburn, who was the longtime Speaker of the House. And so when he became a lobbyist, he knew all the important people who could get things done for his clients. After Watergate, the way power is held in D.C. was changed. We elected scores of Watergate reformers who took power from the presidency and pushed it to Congress and from congressional leaders to committees and subcommittees. So much so that Tommy Boggs used to joke that after Watergate, when he went up to Capitol Hill and yelled out, "Hey, Mr. Chairman," half the people would turn around and wave back to him because so many people had, committee gavels or power. The point is that at that point, lobbying sort of became more democratized, or companies needed to hire a lot more lobbyists. The lobbying industry really grew because Tommy Boggs knew a couple people, but you needed to know dozens or 100 people to get things done, or to know how Congress worked and to block things. The point of all this history is that Donald Trump is reversing that again. He's pulling power back to the White House. He's skipping Congress. He's not even using his own agencies. His own agencies are too slow. He's only acting by executive order. And therefore, the only person who has any power right now in D.C. is Donald Trump. So you don't need all those lobbyists to go to Capitol Hill and work the appropriations process in the Ways and Means Committee, because there's no bills except for the tax bill. So we've moved back to an era where sort of the big time fat cat lobbyists like Tommy Boggs would rule the day. And that's why I go back to Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort, a guy named Brian Ballard, is a very small group of people who Donald Trump knows and trusts. And every company and every foreign country is trying to hire that small group of people because they have the president's ear. So that's really the fundamental way that Trump has changed how lobbying works.
Are these new lobbyists who are targeting the new administration? It may be too soon to tell, but are they effective? I mean, are we seeing results? As I mentioned, the administration is only 2 months old. What are they doing? And can we tell?
So a couple of different answers. If you look back to the first Trump administration, there are certainly examples where hiring some of the people close to Trump helped you get what you wanted. TikTok might be a good example where TikTok hires a couple people close to Trump and all of a sudden Trump changes his mind on TikTok. There's other examples like that. But another point is that a lot of these companies, these big Fortune 500 companies, they've got tons of money. The amount of money they allocate to lobbying is relatively small compared to how much money they're making in the marketplace. And for them, just having one of these people on retainer, just in case you need to make the phone call, it doesn't mean you need Trump all the time. But you want to have someone who can get to Trump if you have a crisis. So even though we haven't seen, I think it's too soon this year to see examples. I think we certainly will. But the point is that those lobbyists close to Trump still are doing really well because all these companies want to hire them just in case they need them.
Well, this suggests that we may learn a lot more next month in April. The first quarterly report by lobbyists will be due April 20. And one of the things that lobbyists have to disclose is whether they've been lobbying the White House. So it sounds to me like that's the next story you're going to be working on. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you take a list of the dozen or so lobbyists closest to Trump, and you look at how many clients they had in the last quarter of last year or a year ago when Biden is president, and compare that to the first year of this quarter, you're going to see a huge spike. And conversely, you're going to look at the lobbyists who are close to Biden, the lobbyists who used to work for Joe Biden in the Senate or in the vice president's office or in the White House. And you'll see that all sorts of clients fired them because they no longer need to get to Biden.
Well, I mentioned in my intro that in addition to your book and your history of lobbying, you received a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on a topic that was a little narrower, but it's still an important element of the regulatory system that we have with respect to honest government here in Washington, which is conflicts of interest. The Wall Street Journal, through your leadership and that of your colleagues, did a magnificent job of disclosing how frequently government officials may own investments, stock usually, in companies that they regulate. And I know from one of your colleagues, James Grimaldi, he'd carried that into judges. Judges have to disclose their investments. And oftentimes he discovered that judges own stock in companies that are parties in front of the judge and litigating in their court. How did that effort begin? How did you and your colleagues decide, wow, this is an area we really ought to take a look at?
So you made a great point earlier about disclosure and sort of public records. I think a lot of people think that Washington operates in darkness and in secret. And in fact, I found in my career, the opposite is true. There's so much disclosure now. There's so much information out there that actually, as a reporter, one of my problems is that there's too much disclosure. In a way, like if you took Joe Biden's, or let's say Kamala Harris's presidential, third quarter fundraising report and printed it out, which is what I used to do, and tried to look at it, it's too much information. You can't figure out what's going on. So about 10 years ago, I started looking into the financial stock ownerships of members of Congress. There's only 535 members of Congress. There's a very good disclosure system. You can find out in 30 seconds how much a stock in Apple your member of Congress owns. So I went through all financial disclosure forms of members of Congress and figured out what industries they owned. And more importantly, looked for people who were on the key communications committees who were investing in communications stocks. And in Congress, all of those stock ownerships are legal under the ethics rules. But that sort of planted a seed with me. I thought, well, we know what members of Congress own, and it's legal and it's disclosed. What do people own at federal agencies? And not just the top people who we focus on. The chairman or the Secretary of Defense probably doesn't own Boeing stock, and the Secretary of Ag isn't invested in farms. But what about all the thousands of people who work for those agencies? People like my father who worked at the Federal Communications Commission for his whole life. In fact, he would tell me over dinner when we were kids that he couldn't own stock in Apple. He couldn't own stock in AT&T because he created the rules and regulations for those companies. And that made a lot of sense. But we figured, let's go look at these forms. Every mid-level or higher appointee or career official in the federal government needs to file an annual financial disclosure form that is supposedly public, that goes to sort of an ethics office within the agency. So myself and a colleague, Rebecca Ballhaus, who spent a few months going to about 70 different agencies and asking just to get those forms. And we didn't know what we were going to see, but we spent a few months trying to get all these forms. These forms are, thousands of pages long. And then at some point we started looking at them and we said, I remember we started the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission is a big antitrust enforcer. At the time, they were running investigations into all the big tech companies. So we said, and it's a relatively small agency. I think there's only about 200 people at the agency who are required to file these financial disclosure forms. But these are the people who are really running the agency. You wouldn't recognize any of their names, but they're the people driving the agency's work. So we said, what would we hope that they would not own? And we said, well, we hope that these guys would not own stock in Google, Amazon, Facebook. And we opened up these forms and they all own stock in Google, Amazon, and Facebook. And we thought, what's going on here? So then we went to the Defense Department and we said, well, what should you not own at the Defense Department? Well, you probably shouldn't own big defense contractors. And they own big defense contractors. And I should be clear, Not everyone, not a majority, but we found overall across tens of thousands of these forms we looked at that about 1 in 3 federal agency officials own stock in a company that their agency regulated. So people at the EPA, own stock in General Motors or electric utilities, and people at the Commerce Department own big Fortune 500 companies that are doing work with the Commerce Department. So it just seemed to us that it's something that we should put out there for the public to see, because I think it sort of undermined faith in the government a little bit, that you want your government regulators to be free of conflicts and be doing the best job they can to, regulate industries without having a dog in the fight. And a lot of times we saw that people seem to have a dog in the fight.
Well, this is a very important area of ethics and legal compliance. As you said, it's not per se illegal to own stock, whether you're a congressman or a government official. What is problematic is if you own stock in a company that you, as a congressperson or a government official, are actively involved in regulating. Now, you can belong to the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission, but not have a job that has anything to do with regulating the companies directly. I mean, it depends on whether you're making regulations, whether you're involved in the enforcement process and compliance and things of that sort. And if you do own stock under those circumstances, the rules say what you have to do is either disqualify yourself, which is called recusal. You don't participate in those decisions at the government, or you get rid of your stock. So this is a somewhat complicated process. And I'm opining on this in part, not just because I'm familiar with the rules, but many years ago, I served on the President's Commission on Federal Ethics Rule Reform, which was created by then President H.W. Bush. And our mandate was to take a look at all these ethics rules. And one of our objectives was we're going to try and make these rules the same government-wide, which means we want to make sure that conflicts of interest apply the same to the executive branch as well as the judicial branch and Congress. And one of the things that we encountered was that that's difficult to do government-wide, particularly with conflicts of interest with respect to members of the House and senators, in part because if they are required to recuse themselves, they are forfeiting their obligation to represent their constituents, whether it's a congressional district or an entire state. So it gets more complicated to try and figure out how conflicts of interest work depending on which part of government you're dealing with. You don't have the same problem in the executive branch. You recuse yourself, somebody else in the executive branch gets involved.
That's one of the reasons we look at this, is that the remedy, as you say, in the legislative branch with Congress is disclosure, not recusal. And therefore, everyone is essentially allowed to do it. So we're just looking at what they own. We're not saying it's illegal. In the executive branch, it's different. There is a federal criminal law that says, essentially, you cannot own stock in a company in which you are actively regulating. And we seem to bump into a lot of examples, or at least a lot of examples that really look like people were involved in those issues. Or this is a good example. There was a guy at the Pentagon who was buying and selling stock in Lockheed Martin, and he worked in the Defense Acquisition Office. So my colleague, Rebecca Ballhouse, called him and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I don't work on Lockheed issues, but it just seems like from my knowledge of how the government works, we're going to be giving a lot of government contracts to Lockheed, so I'm going to invest in the company." He may be able to go before a judge and say, "Hey, I was not trading on the inside information." But from our point of view, what does the American public think about that? It just seems like it loses people's faith and trust in the government when people inside the government have these sort of unfair advantages that can make themselves wealthy.
I think that's correct. And I think that's the reason, for example, Congress recently is debating whether to not permit members and senators to own stock and instead to engage in investing, which should be encouraged. I mean, we're all capitalists. Even congressmen, even Democrats are capitalists, right? Look at Nancy Pelosi, for Pete's sake. She's enormously wealthy because of her husband, who's a very successful investor. Well, if you're going to invest as a public official, do it in mutual funds and not individual stock, which are more dispersed. You obviously have an excellent reputation as a journalist. You've won prizes. You've worked with people and colleagues who have similar integrity. But a lot of polls are suggesting that mainstream media and established journalists and journalism doesn't have quite the credibility among Americans that it once did. I mean, we have referred to the Watergate era. I mean, that probably was the peak when public confidence in reporting existed. It's way down now. If you do a popularity poll, journalism is right down there with used car dealers, for Pete's sake. What is your assessment of the status of journalism today? And is it that bad, in your opinion? Obviously, the public thinks so. And if so, what could change? What should change to increase public confidence?
I think there are many problems that the mainstream media has these days. Some of them have come from the rise of social media. I mean, the mainstream media used to be the only way people got their information. And the rise of social media, therefore, is a good thing to sort of democratize the news business, allow people to get their news from other channels. However, a bigger problem I think we have is the perceived bias, the perceived left-wing bias in the media. I mean, Republicans clearly and Donald Trump clearly think that the New York Times and the Washington Post and CBS and most national news outlets are biased toward the left. In my opinion, in my time working in Washington, D.C., there are no reporters who are intentionally trying to bias stories towards Democrats. However, your average mainstream reporter comes from a very similar background, which is white, elite school, grew up on the East Coast, doesn't own a gun, doesn't go to church. And, the more you add on these descriptors, the more you're describing what Democrats are. We live in cities surrounded by Democrats. We don't go out hunting. We don't live in rural America. And therefore, I can say I'm right down the middle. But I'm right down the middle in my left-wing world. And, if you grow up in Missouri and look at me, you think that I'm a crazy, person on the left. I mean, I think I'm in the middle. It's just that my middle is different than your middle. And I think that's sort of the problem, that therefore there is sort of an inherent anti-Republican, anti-conservative bias. We're also, most reporters, certainly ones in DC, we're all doing well. We own houses and we have a stake in society, and we're doing well compared to the rest of the country. And I think that makes the media part of the establishment. And the rest of the country currently hates the establishment.
Well, DC is problematic based on your fellow citizens voting in the District of Columbia. Over 90% voted for the Democrat in the last election, not the Republican. And I would say that the joining jurisdictions of Maryland and Virginia also vote Democratic. And it's no accident that the largest percentage of government officials reside in those three jurisdictions. And they tend to be like journalists, that went to a lot of their college graduates. They are perhaps majority white, although not necessarily so. And if they're not, they tend to be liberal even more. It's a problem. And it seems to me that there's going to be quite a shakeout in journalism. There is quite a shakeout because there are so many alternative vehicles and means of obtaining news and information. It doesn't mean it's more reliable or more credible. It means that the reader is going to have to be more discriminating as to how much credibility their source of information is. Well, I really appreciate all of your commentary and insight into lobbying as well as journalism. Congratulations on the Pulitzer Prize. By the way, I've always asked my reporter friends, I said, well, who was nominated for investigative journalism in 2016 in predicting that Donald Trump was going to win that election? Instead, the Pulitzer Prize, as I recall, went to a reporter from the Washington Post who wrote about the abuses of a Donald Trump charitable foundation. That was the big reveal in 2016, according to the Pulitzer Committee. But everything we're discussing here involves reading. Other than your own book, I assume you spend time reading other folks' work. Do you have any recommendations for our listeners as to books that they might put on their list to read?
Yeah, I'll give you two. So I just started Ezra Klein's book, which I think is all the rage right now, but I have literally on page 1. So maybe I shouldn't recommend it, but that's what I'm reading right now. If you're looking for something that's off the news.
That's Abundance?
Abundance, right?
Yeah.
If you're looking for a really fun, entertaining book that can distract you from the uncertainty going on in the world right now, my colleague Valerie Bauerlein wrote a book that came out last summer about the Alec Murdaugh murder in South Carolina called, I think, Devils at His Elbow, which I thought was totally fantastic. There's much more to that story than I knew. And it's a nice distraction from today's world. Those are the two that I would recommend.
Well, thank you. That's Abundance, written by Ezra Klein. I think he had a co-author, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But I'm sorry that I don't have that name, but I want to give that person equal recognition in some fashion. And Valerie Bauerlein's book about the Murdaugh episode down in South Carolina, which is quite interesting, Devil at His Elbow.
Right.
I want to thank you again, Brody Mullins, for your reading suggestion and for your insights on law, lobbying, politics, journalism. I also want to thank our producer, Jody Mayer Piazza, and thanks to the Holtzman Vogel Law Firm for its support of this program. As a reminder, any opinions expressed here are those of the host, that's me, and our guests, like Brody, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors or their clients. All of our episodes are available on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, as well as other streaming platforms. I hope our listeners will join us again on the next episode of Early Returns. I hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Baran. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.